Hello everybody and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we'll be talking about Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania on this box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw the film come in around $65 million less than what the projections had been. This film was projected to make around $280 million by the same people over at Deadline. I remember covering this bit of news on my stream earlier this week, and obviously those were some early projections, and usually you see some fluctuations, but $65 million difference, that is quite the difference, to say the very least. Of course, much of that, in fact, all of that really is coming from the fact it is not performing internationally nearly as well as they had thought. There was apparently some speculation by Nancy and Tony over at Deadline that it could be the sci-fi elements of the film that may not resonate as well with some of the Asian countries, and that's the reason why the film isn't doing nearly as well as they had thought it was going to be. And for me, I just look at it and say, okay, that might be an excuse, and that might, again, even explain a couple of things, but how do you get it $65 million wrong is my question, especially when you have all of those different caveats. Normally, when you have those caveats and you have those little bits of information, your numbers normally reflect that in a certain way. You try to take a more conservative approach to it, but even the more conservative estimates did not have this really accounted for as far as the early, before the weekend numbers started actually coming in. So yeah, this film not doing nearly as well as had been projected, and when you compare this film to the other Ant-Man films, and of course also to the broader, wider ranging MCU, the film, especially for its budget compared to its previous counterparts, is really not all that impressive when all is said and done. So we'll talk about that. We'll also give some updates to some of the numbers for Avatar: Way of Water. I'm sure everyone, of course, always looks forward to my commentary on Avatar, but let's just say, yeah, the gap between Avatar: Way of Water's domestic numbers and that of Top Gun: Mavericks is almost a dead heat. It's about a $7 million difference, and so exactly what I said was going to happen is indeed actually coming to fruition. Sometimes I get it right. We also have some week 2 numbers for Magic Mike Last Dance to talk about as well. But before we go any further, though, please make sure you smash that like button, slap that fire button if you're watching over on Odyssey, and smash the rumble button as well. Also, make sure you are subscribed to the channel with the bell notification on. That way you know every time a video or live stream goes live on the channel. I want to say first a huge thank you to all of the new subscribers on the channel. This last couple of months especially has been kind of, a hit and miss. There's been people who believe in because of the, comments that I've made about Avatar: Way of Water. There's some people who have been joining on and following. A lot of people from FNT, of course, who finally, cross over and say, hey, let's see what this Odin guy has to actually say, because he doesn't speak a whole lot on FNT, and much of that is usually not by complete choice. It's just that, obviously, I don't like stepping over people's toes when I don't have to. Let's talk about the box office numbers, though. Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania mania flies to $225 million worldwide amid softness in Asia Pacific. Ah, yes, Nancy. Give it to me straight. Quantumania has landed with an estimated 225 opening through Sunday. The split on the Peyton Reed directed threequel is 104 million domestic, which, by the way, is actually very much in line with what the projections were. So kudos to that. They've seemed to at least gotten to the point of getting pretty close in their domestic numbers there, and their domestic projections, and 121.3 million from the international box office. Internationally, and this is where I love their numbers, and I love the way that they try to skew things here. Internationally, Quantumania is estimated to be 13% of the original Ant-Man film, and this is, of course, without adjusting for inflation, 27% below Ant-Man and the Wasp on a like-for-like basis. And then it says, removing China from the comparison, the opening weekend for Quantumania is 52% ahead of Ant-Man and 5% ahead of Ant-Man and the Wasp. I just think that's just so disingenuous for them to be doing these types of things the way that they are, right? Just give it to us straight and explain, okay, is it because it wasn't released in China for those other films? Last I had heard, I thought all of the films had gotten a China release, and we'll dive into that live just to see exactly why they're putting this into the overall equation, or if they're trying to say that China hasn't gotten to the point of it coming back fully for movie theaters, even though Avatar: Way of Water clearly showed that was not the case when this film made hundreds of millions of dollars. Again, talking about Avatar. especially for the Communist Party of China. But again, interesting nonetheless that this film is actually very much not doing as well internationally, even compared to a lot of the other films within the franchise. The 4-day domestic start of 118 million is the third best President's Day opening weekend ever. So again, that's the projections they have right now for what the film will make, adding tomorrow, Monday's numbers there. But as we noted yesterday, the global debut is lower than pre-weekend offshore projections, 65 million to be exact. You don't want to give an exact number there. That's down to softness in Asia Pacific outside Australia, and also the deeper sci-fi elements that don't tend to play there, notably in South Korea and China. Yes, please. Give me more excuses. The later came in with 19.2 million, sharply off the low end of the expected range of 35 to 55 million. Yeah, that's putting it very, very politely, I would say. So clearly a lot of shilling coming from Deadline as they try to cover their tracks. As we can see from the actual domestic numbers that are being reported, though, Ant-Man and the Wasp did win the number one spot at the box office very, very easily. So $100 million, again, that's a decent opening, right? Especially for MCU fare, that seems to be pretty standard. I'm sure we could also look at that $224 million and say, yeah, it's nowhere near the $450 million that was made by Doctor Strange: The Multiverse of Madness, nowhere near the, $300+ million that was made by the other films that came out this past year. Let me go ahead and go to my chart a little bit earlier than I typically do. Let's see, Thor, Love, and Thunder, just to give ourselves a bit of a comparison here. Thor, Love, and Thunder opened to $302 million. Again, that film, complete trash, opened up to $302 million worldwide. Black Panther: Wakanda Forever opened to $330 million worldwide. So as you can see, we have had ourselves a bit of a progression, right? We had the $450 million opening of Doctor Strange 2, and then we saw that drop off incredibly high, by an incredible amount, between that film and Thor, right, which is probably one of the worst films to come out last year. And then we saw the film see a little bit of a bump with Black Panther, but as I had mentioned, even in the coverage of that film, a lot of that was because of, obviously, the wanting to say goodbye to Chadwick Boseman. What were they going to do with that? How were they going to handle that? So again, using the death of someone to try to market your movie, it's always kind of a crappy thing in my opinion, but also because we knew that this film would definitely have a stronger domestic take and stronger domestic run than some of these other films, because Black Panther, the first film, was known for being one of the best performing domestic releases in the entire history of the MCU, and it still holds up and actually holds its own against films even like Infinity War, for instance, where again it's one of the top films. So yeah, let's just say that Ant-Man and the Wasp is absolutely showing, one, why Ant-Man as a franchise is just one of the lowest grossing of the franchise, and two, that the current progress of the MCU, and I imagine they were getting some of these early numbers. Remember, it was just the other day that we officially got the word that they have decided to move the Marvels, right? Their next big one. In fact, I believe it was supposed to be like their biggest one of the year. Like they were expecting this film to do 280+ million, right? To kind of get things started off strong. And then they were going to have Guardians come in and try and, blow some people's socks off. I'm not really all excited about Guardians, to be honest, because the second film was not that good. And I think James Gunn kind of has lost the magic he had. The first film was so good. The first film was so great. And it's so great to go back to that first film constantly. Whereas the second film, I think rewatched it one time because my wife hadn't seen it in theaters, didn't get a chance to. And even she was like, and she's not really that much of a movie person, she was like, yeah, I don't ever feel the need to watch this ever again. And this is just nowhere near as good as the first movie. And so I just can't imagine that the third film is going to be all that great. Now, that being said, I do think the worldwide numbers for that movie probably will be a lot higher than that for Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. But this film was given the typical box office budget. At least right now, the early estimates are that the film was given around a $200 million budget, which is not typical for Ant-Man films. Usually Ant-Man gets around $120 to $160 million in a budget. So they gave this film maybe $40 to $100 million more than what a typical release for Ant-Man would be. And they only got just a few million dollars, really, when all is said and done, back on it, especially when you actually look at the number of ticket sales. And we'll dive into those numbers too, because that's, I think, a very interesting part to look at with all of this. But yeah, Ant-Man and the Wasp, 65 million underneath the early projections. Definitely not a good start for this film. We'll have to wait with the number for the week 2 numbers, of course, to see what kind of drop off this has. Does it see the 68% plus drop off that we saw from Doctor Strange: Multiverse of Madness? Do we see the 60 plus drop off that we saw for other films like Thor: Love and Thunder, and to a lesser degree or to a similar degree of Black Panther: Wakanda Forever? If it has that same type of drop, having made this much less than all those other films, yes, that puts this film in a situation where $600 million as a cap would likely be a scenario. Now, that means that the film would likely make its money back as its break-even point based on the estimate of $200 million, which has not been confirmed yet at this point as the recording of this video, is still not going to be nearly enough, though, to really bring a lot of confidence into it, and probably will explain about why they decided to shift away the Marvels, because, again, they were kind of hoping, I bet, that Guardians would do so well, right? It would just bring so much money in that it would kind of be able to have that same type of momentum shift, right? That same type of build that, you know, the first Captain Marvel had when it was very close to the release of Endgame. People thought, oh, I need to see this because this film is leading right into Endgame, coming out about a month right beforehand. It's going to be so... And the film made $1 billion, and the film ended up being, even people who praised it said, yeah, if I had to put this and rank this for an MCU title, it's still middle of the pack. You know, people would give it like an A+ score, said it was amazing. When asked to rank it, they still put it in the middle of the pack, showing that it was at best, a middling film. So yeah, the Marvels, Captain Marvel 2, yeah, not looking good for the MCU going forward. Looking at some of the other films, though, on the list, we see some pretty good numbers right here. So remember that now we are the post-Super Bowl weekend, so Avatar Way of Water seeing a 15% drop. So that actually makes a lot of sense, right, to see those lower drop-offs. You would expect to see this on a lot of these movies, saying that last weekend it was higher than what the average or higher than what the normal would be because of the Super Bowl. Now we're seeing them, you know, kind of bring back that a little bit. So kind of like an offset from last weekend. So a 15% drop for Avatar Way of Water, $6.1 million. A lot of that is still coming from those premium screens. But however, the actual domestic number, $657 million total, after 10 weeks of release, means that this film is likely not going to be able to catch up to the number, or actually be able to end at the number that was originally made by Top Gun Maverick, and we'll go into the numbers on that in just a second. Magic Mike saw a 33% drop in its second weekend, but the reason why this is really bad, one, last weekend, as I mentioned, was Super Bowl weekend, so a lot of these films were down. Two, this actually did exactly what I said that they were probably going to do, right? It was only out at 1,500 screens. They added that extra 1,500 to make this a full wide release. My guess is they said, hey, not a lot of people are going to be out in the films for the weekend of the Super Bowl anyway. Might as well not put it out in all of our theaters yet. Let's try and have like a soft release, try and get some word of mouth, and then full release it in its second week and see if we can get some money. But no, this film actually dropped 33%. Normally, when you see this kind of an ad this early on in a release, you normally see an increase. The fact that this film dropped 33% says a lot about just the genuine interest in this film and really lack of interest in this film. And I don't really know much about this specific iteration of the Magic Mike film. I know it's the ending of this trilogy, of this franchise, and Steven Soderbergh has come back to it. So if you've seen the film, please let me know if you thought it was any good, or if you thought it was as good as at least of the first film. But regardless of that, it's just not on paper, not looking all that great for this film. Film likely to end up being another financial failure for Warner Brothers, which really that is itself not all that surprising. Coming on the number 4 spot is Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. I was able to finally see this movie. I thought it was kind of overhyped by a lot of people. It was good, but it was definitely not as great as some people said. I thought that this film definitely still geared itself towards, and I mean, it is a kid's movie, right? It geared more towards kids, but I always just do prefer those films that just come across in a much more, mature element where they are clearly things there that kids enjoy, but then there's also a lot of stuff for adults too. Like my wife and I just recently rewatched the film Up, for instance, and that's a perfect movie where there's the silly stuff, right, and the characters that are going to be able to make kids laugh, but then you look at the actual story itself and how just mature that story actually is, and that's just not what we're getting in a lot of the animated films that we're getting from either from Disney or from Universal, from DreamWorks or any of these places. And so this film, though, regardless of that, still doing quite well. So even though I wasn't the biggest fan, $5.2 million after 9 weeks of release, very impressive, 60% drop there. So very impressive numbers there, $166 million in the domestic. This film has definitely done much better than what the original projections were. A clear chart breaker, just like with Avatar. Knock at the Cabin, not nearly as impressive. 3 weeks out, dropping already 1,000 screens. So Universal looked at this film and said, hey, we can squeeze out just enough to break even, maybe make a little bit of profit on it, but ultimately it's not really looking all that great and not looking like we wanted. What we're hoping for this movie, my guess is that they're pulling this, trying to make more way for other Universal films either about to be released or that are currently in release to make up some money. 80 for Brady coming at the number 6 spot, 38% drop there, 820 screens, and it is lost in its third week of release. So yeah, not surprised to see a drop of that magnitude. This film also cost a little bit more than what Paramount probably should have spent on it. Probably will end up being a box office flop now that we can, again, look at those numbers in further context. Titanic's Anniversary dropped 66%. This is not a surprise, though, as the film has been out for quite a long time. New film, Marlowe. That's right, a new film with Open Road and Liam Neeson coming together. In this instance, it's not an action film from what I've been told, but I still have no interest in going to see it because it's an open road Liam Neeson production, and I don't understand that relationship, and they just put out, it seems at least, 2 to 3 films every single year, and they're all just very generic. They all seem straight to streaming service, straight to DVD type movies. And I don't know why they're putting them out really at this point, but this film only $837 per screen. So unless you're a hardcore fan of Liam Neeson, there really wasn't anyone going to see this film. The film missing, dropping the number 9 spot, 32% drop. This film, though, had made its money back. And so even though it's starting to leave a lot of screens, it's really not adding all that much to it. It's made its money. Man Called Otto, still waiting on this one to be fully done before doing the full breakdown of it. And the film Megan coming in the number 11 spot, $1.3 million. This film also just adding on to its money. And as you can see, $93.4 million. Again, $100 million on the table. It's becoming a lot less likely as every week goes on, though. Again, if this type of 40% drop every single week happening does go on, we're looking at probably capping out closer to 96, 97. Maybe they do a final push. Maybe they do a final, to push it over the edge to get to 100 million domestically. Either way, though, it's a win because they made their money back. And then there was also a very small release of Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey at 434 screens. This was a film actually I was wanting to see for that very reason of the fact that it just looks so ridiculous. But it is limited because of that Fathom event label on it. So I'll have to wait and see exactly whether it's still playing or not and whether I can see it with the day off that I will have from work tomorrow. All right, let's go ahead and dive into Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. So $225.3 million, $65 million underneath where this film was projected to actually go. This film also got a release in China. This film, as it had mentioned earlier, gave about $20 million or so to China, which means that, again, you're looking already at about $10 million or so going to the CCP. And I imagine that by the end of it, you'll have tens of millions of dollars going to the CCP because of this movie, which, hey, not anywhere close to the hundreds of millions of dollars that is going to the CCP because of Avatar: Way of Water, but still, it's all coming from the same company anyway, because Disney is the one who runs with it. Now, looking at the actual numbers themselves and the little adjusted for inflation chart actually has helped me figure things out a little bit. For one, it's let me realize that whatever they're using for inflation, they must have some system where they only use a certain quarter of the year's inflation numbers, because when you look and use just the Bureau of Labor Statistics and you look at what a dollar was back in 2015, back in what it was in 2018, you realize that the numbers that they're using to adjust for inflation here are actually not nearly as bad. And so I've readjusted some of it in the chart that I've made, but either way, it actually shows really the point that's being made nonetheless. But just look at the films, right? $62 million for the first Ant-Man, $76 million for the second Ant-Man and the Wasp, $104 million. So clearly it is the greatest, it is the highest number. But remember, this film was given another $60+ million. Again, the first film was $141 million when you adjust for inflation. Second film, $130 million when you adjust for inflation. So you're looking at the films getting an extra $60 to $70 million compared to the previous ones. And it only made an extra, what was that? An extra, $25 million or so. It becomes a lot less of an impressive feat when you look at the actual number of ticket sales, though. So clearly it is winning here. The big question that I'll have, of course, is because of the bad reviews, not just from critics, but also just the fact that it's not a good film. And I think a lot of just general audiences picking up on that, whether or not that's going to have a major impact down the line. And as you saw, these two films, right, capped at around 564 versus 627. I would not be surprised to see this film fall somewhere in between those numbers, though that 564 of the first one might actually be in the actual cards themselves. And so talking about that film, just to talk about the chart I'm mentioning here. So I brought this down the other day. So this is, again, adjusting for inflation. So this is actually taking it, and it's slightly different than what you may have seen previously. I did a breakdown of this chart on my live stream earlier this week, and I had the setting, I had it set to the beginning of 2023's inflation numbers according to BLS. So I decided to change it to the end of 2022 instead, and that changed the numbers a little bit to get closer to what Box Office Mojo's were, or rather what the numbers said. So adjusted for inflation, the first film made $68 million in its opening, $85 million for Ant-Man and the Wasp, $104 million obviously for Quantumania. But here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. 6 million tickets versus 8 million tickets versus 11. So you think about it this way. You spend an extra $60 million or so on your film, and it gets you an extra 3 million tickets sold. And these are numbers, especially for Ant-Man and the Wasp 2018 and Quantumania, where those two films, especially more so this film than the 2018 film, but both still probably had a lot more higher price tickets being sold for, just like what was talked about with Avatar previously, right? You look at the fact that most people going to see it are seeing it in IMAX or seeing it in some premium format screens, which means the average ticket price for the film is going to be a lot higher than the average ticket price for the year. This is using the average ticket price for the years as they were being given, right? It's 2015's numbers and 2018's numbers, right? Using the average ticket price there to try to figure out exactly how many tickets were actually being sold. So when you take that into account, you realize this film, not only did they spend an extra $60 million to get 3 million tickets, but they probably didn't even get any gain whatsoever in ticket sales, and if any, a very small bump. And so what that tells me is that the money that they're using and they're trying to pump into these franchises and to the MCU, it's just not working. It's just not working. The numbers seem to play that out very, very well. I need to, again, get in touch with Valiant Renegade to see if he's figured out a way to kind of adjust for films like, Avatar Way of Waters, average ticket price, and Ant-Man and the Wasp average ticket price, if there's a formula he's come up with to get a better than right now the average ticket price across the United States is around $9. And I know that as far as people going to see it opening weekend is concerned, that there's just no way that they are spending, again, just knowing this by being in opening night 2D screen for this showing of Quantumania, no one was in there. So again, it would be interesting to see those numbers. Avatar Way of Water, though, let's go ahead and talk about that. So $2.2 billion. As you all know, this film easily won the 2022 box office worldwide. But what has been interesting is the domestic box office, because at $657 million, that means that the movie, when compared to Top Gun Maverick at the same point in its release, right? Maverick still winning out those weekends in the 10th, 11th, etc. frames. It's probably going to be 11th and 12th frames. It'll win out there too. But the numbers only tracks to the 10th week's numbers. And as you can see from this, right, you had it dropping once again to being well below $1 million, right? 690,000, 680,000. So this is something that had not yet happened in the release of Top Gun Maverick. And so look at these numbers here, 650 million versus 657 million. And so if the Monday to Thursday numbers continue to be that $500,000 or so, we could see that even by this next coming weekend, right, that you actually see Top Gun Maverick actually take over where Avatar is currently in its release. And so I do think Avatar Way of Water is not going to be able to beat out Top Gun Maverick, which means Top Gun Maverick will have indeed the crown for the domestic box office for 2022. But that does, of course, not take away from the massive worldwide box office of Avatar Way of Water. Magic Mike Last Dance, $37.7 million. Higher budget than projected, or higher budget than they probably should have spent on it. And even though it's looking like the top of the charts here, really isn't all that impressive, and likely will end up losing more money for Warner Brothers. I believe is Warner Brothers production. $422 million for Last Witch. But again, I do need to call out the fact that they did get a release in China. Again, not a whole lot of money going to China, but still, come on. Y'all are better than that. Y'all did not need that money. This film was already a success in its own right in so many different ways. Knock at the Cabin at $47.2 million, very close to its break even. 80 for Brady, 32 million, cost more than they should have spent on it. May not break even, may lose some money. We'll have to wait and see. Titanic, of course, is at $2.2 billion. Of course, this is just all of the releases put together, all without adjusting for inflation. Marlowe at $2.6 million. Missing at $29.6 million. This film had already made its money back. Man Called Otto, almost $100 million worldwide. Megan at $170 million, so pretty impressive there. Plane, I wanted to mention this film because it is making still some money internationally. It's not making anything at this point domestically, but it's making enough to where the thought of a break even is still out there. It's not a guarantee, but it is definitely still out there. And also, I know that there was one person at the very least in my comment section who was obsessed with this movie and saying that the film was going to get to 900 million because of later releases in China, etc. It's not looking like that's going to happen. The film did make another like $9 or $10 million because of those later releases. The film has so far made 14.7 according to this chart, though this is usually a little bit behind. But as you can see, opening weekend numbers for China was only about 6 million. So this is what happens when you have a delayed release in those numbers. And so it's not going to be nearly enough to push the film to 900 million. Still a film that was able to make its money back based off of the numbers that I have in front of me. Let's go ahead and look at the box office charting because we like to do some charting here on OMB Reviews. So first off, talking about Ant-Man, Quantumania. We don't have a budget yet. Again, I hunted for it. I hunted for it, in the words of one John Campea. By the way, he is nominated for Shill of the Year, 5th year in a row, nominated for Shill of the Year at the Raven Awards that I host. Check out the pinned comment below if you want to vote in that. Right now, it's a pretty interesting race between him and Jeremy from Geeks and Gamers because of his takes on Avatar, amongst other things, but it's a fun one. Jeremy is taking it in stride. He's embracing it, and it's a lot of fun because of that. But we don't have any actual numbers yet, and so right now the projections are that it costs probably around 200 million because that is pretty much the standard for most Marvel films at this point in time. And if that is indeed the case, the break even is 500 million. I think that probably will be able to be passed, especially when you compare the numbers to the first Ant-Man and second Ant-Man, respectively, with those proper adjustments, because that is what gives us the best understanding of what the likely actual final number will be. Regardless of that, as of this point, it's at $164.8 million in the red, so it still has quite a ways to go. Marlowe, there is no budget reported for that film. Those films tend to not cost that much money, but also don't make that much money, so usually they end up breaking even or losing. I don't quite understand that relationship, as I've mentioned previously, but it is what it is. The one film that we can now make some projections on, though, because we do have those week 2 numbers, is for Magic Mike's Last Dance. So with $37.7 million by its second weekend, we can project the film will end somewhere between $53 and $75 million based off of typical historical standards. And because of its budget and its break-even point being 117.5, the chances this film make its money back are not very likely. Likely instead will lose somewhere between $38 and $25 million. Knock at the Cabin, as I had mentioned, was likely going to make some money back. It's looking like that is going to happen by next weekend. 80 for Brady, I had said, was going to be likely a financial loss. It's looking like that is probably going to hold out as well. Missing made its money back, but is pretty much done at making money at this point in time. Plane is at $6 million in the red. So already is actually doing better than what had been expected, more than doubling what it made in its first 2 weeks. So, hey, it's a chart breaker in that regard. So kudos to Plane for that. So maybe has enough in the tank internationally to be able to get to that break-even point, but we'll have to wait and see whether or not it's actually going to be able to do that. Other films I was able to update: Puss in Boots, $126 million in net game profits, one of the best performing films of the year when you compare it to the first 2 weeks of its release, right? So almost tripling what it made, right, in the first 3 weeks, which is kind of crazy to think about. Avatar: Way of Water, also very impressive numbers here. $2.2 million is, again, compared to its original 2 weeks, getting kind of close to where Puss in Boots is percentage-wise. $655 million in net gain profit, if you, of course, believe that the production budget was only $460 million, where, again, if you look at the words of James Cameron, it likely costs a little bit more than that. And then lastly, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever at $855 million means right now the film is looking at $138 million in net gain profit, which is actually still just basically average, right? So Black Panther: Wakanda Forever had a very average run for a typical movie, typical big budget film, was able to make its money back. Now, I know that there are some reports out there from people with independent sources saying that this film probably actually cost a lot more based on its budgeting, because apparently some of the budget for other films was put onto this movie instead. We don't have actual official confirmation on that, though, so take that with a grain of salt. Based on the numbers as they have been reported, though, this film, $100 million in the black, but clearly we can look at the numbers for the MCU this year, and they are far below, I think, what they had been hoping for the films to be, and far below what I think they would have expected to be. So anyway, what are y'all's thoughts about Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania? Have you seen it? If so, what are your thoughts about it? Did you think it was good? Did you enjoy it? Do you think that it's going to be able to make its money back? I think that it will. Again, usually films like this, even films that cost $200 million, with this kind of a start, it's looking pretty good. Again, this definitely is the smallest start of an MCU film in the last year. You look at the $300 million, the $330 million made by Black Panther and Thor: Love and Thunder, respectively. You then look to the $450 million that was made by Doctor Strange: Multiverse of Madness. And you look at the end results of those movies, and when it comes to Thor, that film opened to around $300 million or so, and ended up being around $750 million by everything being said and done. With this film being $75 million less than that, and likely to have very similar drop-offs as those other films had from week 1 to week 2, I think that we could probably expect the film to end somewhere close to $600 million when all is said and done. But we'll have our official numbers on that next weekend with our box office breakdown when we get those week 2 totals for that and for Marlowe. And hopefully by then we've got a box office budget as well. So let me know your thoughts about that and anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, like that fire button, Aussie, and smash the rumble button as well. Check out that pinned comment as well to vote in the Raven Awards, and the top link in the video description if you want to have access to podcasts and giveaways and other fun stuff that I do. If you want a rosary or anything like that, it is, of course, a beautiful Sunday. It's Queen Quadragesima Sunday, so right before Ash Wednesday, getting very, very close to the season of Lent, which is one of my favorite liturgical seasons. It's why I've been rocking the purple for the last few weeks. And so hope you all had a blessed Queen Quadragesima Sunday, a blessed Sunday in preparation for Lent. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. You're all wonderful, amazing, beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to all of my Patreon, locals, and Subscribe Star members who are at the Keeper of the Bifrost level and above, starting off with Father Luca Illick, Garrett Searles, Chris from the 80s, who you can check out over on YouTube by the same name, Hymir Irie Hymason, Joe Horn, Jonathan Carney, Orange at Reviews, who you can check out at his YouTube channel by the same name as well, Laura, the Modern Major General Story, Rosetta Allen, who you can check out at her YouTube channel, Eagle Rider, and Miss Martin Muses, which goes by the same name on YouTube. Thank you all very much for supporting me over on Patreon. And also for my Subscribe Star peeps, we got Matt317. Check out his Twitch channel by the same name. Fast Reaction, Mr. Roy, J-Rod the Beer Guru, and ZK-Man, who you can check out over at xtheboundaries.co. And a special shout out to the R. And also, lastly, to my locals members, starting off with Miss Minnesota Hockey Fan, How About a Hockey Player, J.H. Schwalbach, Brett D90, and the amazing lawyer Robert Barnes. Thank you all very much for supporting me for the month of February. You guys are all fantastic. If you want your name shouted out, access to exclusive podcasts, and exclusive giveaways, check out the top link in the video description below. Anyway, you guys are all great. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. And as always, God bless.